Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived, and it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking to Susan Lieberman. Susan is currently the Vice President International Policy at the Wildlife Conservation Society. She has a PhD in biology and ecology from the University of Southern California. And in her career, she has had posts such as at the US Fish and Wildlife Service. She's worked as the Director Species Program at WWF. She was Senior Director International Policy at the Pew Environment Group, and she moved to the Wildlife Conservation Society in 2013. So she's been there for close on 10 years. So welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sue, I wanted to start by asking you, so you did a PhD in biology and ecology. Where did your interest in conservation, ecology, biology, where did that start?
My interest in biology or ecology, though I didn't call it ecology, is from the time I was a child, and I would go hiking with my father and my brother. And then when I moved to Israel to do my bachelor's, even though I had jobs that were working in a laboratory, I particularly enjoyed the field, getting out in the field and the ecology side of things. So my interest was from the time I was very young. I had an insect collection, that sort of thing. But it was also as I did my undergraduate work, even though people sort of were always, oh, you're good in science and math, become a doctor. You're good in science and math. Why are you worried about, frogs and things? I was always interested. That is what my mother said. But I was always interested in ecology and the natural world and conservation.
Mm-hmm. And so you're currently at the Wildlife Conservation Society. What's the Wildlife Conservation Society's remit?
Well, the Wildlife Conservation Society, I like to say, is the big, very important non-governmental organization people probably haven't heard of, because we don't spend a lot of our time lobbying or talking in the media. We work in more than 60 countries on the ground, in the field, on the conservation of wildlife and wild places, their habitats. Our headquarters are in New York at the Bronx Zoo. I happen to live in London. We have people in more than 60 countries all over the world, but our focus is on conservation outcomes, conservation of wild species and of wild places around the world. And we do that in a number of ways, through science, through field work. In particular, we work with government partners, local communities, indigenous peoples, but we also work with governments at the policy level. And that's what I do, to get governments to adopt the right kinds of decisions so when they go home, they do the right thing for conservation. So we work very much at the national level, at the local level, but also at the global level, focused on conservation.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that the EU has recently taken a critical decision in relation to the ivory trade.
Right.
Can you take us a little bit deeper into that?
I'll take you deeper into that, because that's not just like, oh, that came out of the blue. That when I first started working for the U.S. government, and even before then, there was rampant poaching of elephants in Africa for the ivory trade. And the international ivory trade was banned at a meeting in 1989. I was at that meeting, and there has been improvement in in elephant killing and poaching for ivory trade over the years, but increases as well. And we've seen more recently increases due to the involvement of organized crime. And through work, a lot of conservation work, a lot of science, what's really going on in Africa, there's been a move afoot by a number of governments and conservationists to say ivory has to end. we will lose African elephants unless the ivory trade stops. China closed its ivory market. If you told me when I started in the 80s that China would close its ivory market, I would have said no way. The biggest ivory market in the late 80s was the US and not China. The US has closed its ivory market. The UK has. It's taken a bit too long, but the EU has finally moved to further close its domestic ivory market. It's already banned internationally, but this is whether or not people can go into a shop or go online and buy ivory. And of course, if they can, you're still going to have poaching of elephants, right? So really now the only country that still is allowing open sale of ivory is Japan. Mm-hmm. But this has been work and campaigning very hard for a long time. But this is each government saying, we are not going to be the ones contributing to the disappearance of the elephant in Africa.
Mm-hmm. And what is ivory still used for?
Ivory is used it's not used on piano keys anymore, but it's used for jewelry, trinkets, carving, decoration. It has been used as well by collectors. Some of the items are works of art in terms of the amount of time that goes into it. I don't consider it beautiful because it comes from an elephant that was killed, but I think that trend of ivory as an investment has declined significantly since the closure of the market in China by the Chinese government. Mostly it's for people who want jewelry or collectibles, or they think it's beautiful and they want to buy it. But, we can educate people that they shouldn't buy ivory. There's a lot of wildlife products they shouldn't buy. But this is also saying it takes a long time to educate millions of people. Let's also make sure, even if they think they want to buy ivory, when they go to a shop, it's not there because it's not legal.
So in fact, now, even if something was, I don't know, an ivory statue was created 100 years ago, to sell that ivory statue is illegal?
Well, it depends on the country. Don't want to overcomplicate it. If it's really an antique, there are some exemptions, and the exemptions are different in different countries. But if someone has new ivory from a recently killed elephant, a tusk, or a carving, it can't be traded internationally. But now in the US, the UK, the EU, the US, you can't buy it. You can't sell it legally. There are different exemptions for true antiques. There are problems with people laundering new ivory and saying, oh, look, it's an antique. But we're not talking about that sort of fraud.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how does it, the ivory, or how was the ivory going from an alive African elephant to being sold on, say, the European market? What was the process?
I mean, basically, the process is it's simplistic to think of it as someone shoots an elephant and has ivory to sell, but rather it's the traffickers who place the orders, who work out there. This is really organized crime. Okay. These are organized criminals who know that there's a market. They have a trade route set up. They have corrupt officials that they've paid off, and they place orders. And then people go in and tell villagers, poor people, we'll give you a few bucks if you bring us some ivory. It isn't that people make their entire livelihoods out of ivory elephant poaching at all. There are organized networks that run this wildlife trafficking, whether it's ivory, rhino horn, or a lot else. I've been working on this for a number of years, but this is organized criminal gangs that place the orders, et cetera. And I say this because it's easy to think as the poacher as the criminal. But to me, it's the middleman, the traffickers, the syndicates. They're the criminals.
Because I imagine that many of the poachers are, they're doing it to, as you say, just to earn a few more bucks.
That's right. I mean, exactly. In some countries, they're not even local people. They may be people from other areas that are provided with the weapons to go into a national park and poach elephants and other species. But no, this is not. There are other ways. They're often people, it's just for a little extra income, and all the efforts going into anti-poaching. If we didn't have wildlife trafficking, they could also go into improving the livelihoods of local communities.
And how dire is the situation for African elephants and for Asian elephants?
It's bad. The forest elephant is critically endangered, and the savanna elephant, the one you may think of in southern Africa or Kenya, Tanzania, is endangered. But in some countries, with the closure of ivory markets and the efforts at anti-poaching, we're seeing some populations stabilize or increase. It takes time. It's not something where, you just turn on the light or turn off the light and the populations recover. But we are seeing stabilization and recovery in a number of populations. But poaching hasn't stopped either. So we have to maintain the vigilance as well.
I imagine some of it will just go underground with it.
Well, it already was underground.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of people say, well, you can't make it illegal because it'll go underground. It is underground. But the issue is, at the end of the day, it's not how much ivory is seized. It's are elephant populations increasing or decreasing? In Uganda, in other parts of East Africa, Southern Africa, they're stable or increasing. That's the measure of it. So maybe there may still be a case of poaching, but there hasn't been in Uganda or Mozambique, for example, in spite of everything. That's the success.
Mm-hmm. And what have been the critical steps for that to have been made illegal? And what has been the involvement of the Wildlife Conservation Society in making that illegal?
Well, there's been a long process really since the late 80s, early 90s, is to maintain the global international ban on ivory trade under the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. And there's also work at the national level on trade bans and work at the national and local level on setting up protected areas, working with rangers, and anti-poaching on the ground. WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, has been involved at every level. I was working elsewhere, but in the 90s, Wildlife Conservation Society was very active in CITES issues, Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, along with other conservation groups. But we're also particularly active at the national level on ivory legislation and at the local level on anti-poaching. We are tremendously engaged. So we're engaged at all levels.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions I had for you is it more important to protect a species or to protect an ecosystem, or do you need to do both?
You need to do it all. You need to do it all. First of all, you can't protect a species without protecting its ecosystem. But you need to look, if you're looking at species conservation, what are the threats to that species? Take, for example, the elephant of Africa. That threats are the poaching for the ivory trade, but also habitat loss, building of roads into forests for the forest elephant, and mining. And there are other threats. You have to address the threats. Sometimes the threats are because of trade or poaching, and sometimes there are other threats that have to be addressed in other ways. So they're really intricately connected. But you can't just protect a forest or another ecosystem without also looking at the threats to the species, or you end up with a forest that's empty of its species. So they need to be integrated completely.
Mm-hmm. Sue, in your job, what's been, and in your career, what have been the most difficult things that you've done?
It's a hard question to ask. What are the most difficult things? It's hard to say what the most difficult things are. I guess I'd like to say difficult things were stopping the ivory trade and the wild bird trade into the U.S., but we succeeded on that. They were challenging. I think some of the most difficult, actually, because I've worked a lot on wildlife trade, is convincing governments to protect sharks as species, to protect. They understood they need to protect elephants and rhinos and parrots, etc. Wait, but fish are food. They're not species, but they are species. And it's ongoing, but it's been very difficult to convince governments and citizens even that these fish are wildlife too. and to look at populations that are declining and convince government to take action, not to just close their eyes and ears and say, I can't deal with this. There's too much economic interest involved. I don't want to deal with it. So that's been really challenging. It was difficult back in the 90s to get the mahogany of the rainforest of South and Central America covered by the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. It took 3-4 CITES meetings of all the governments. Now they're listed and everyone has no idea what went on. Oh, look, they're listed. That must have been easy. I taught a course to students once who said, oh, that must have been easy. I said, you have no idea. But in a way, they're not. I mean, I should retire and write it all up, but I can't as long as I feel I'm making a difference. And that's been challenging. I think one of the things that is challenging is convincing some donors, if you will, that all of this is really important work, but you have to pay for it. It costs money. It costs money to go to meetings and meet with governments and talk to people. And I spent a lot of time translating science into policy. In other words, scientists can do all the research on the status of sharks and the status of elephants, but how do you translate that into policy to governments to pay attention? So that's I don't say difficult, it's challenging. And it's challenging convincing donors that, you have to please support it, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also one of the hardest things is governments have to be able to listen to the science, not the industry, not the lobbyists. And that's hard. The industry lobbyists. There's a fisheries lobby. There's a timber lobby. Convincing governments that I need to look at the science and I need to act according to the science. It's like governments get it, but they think, what's going to happen in 2 years, not what's going to happen in 10 years. So those are some of the answers, I guess.
I'm Australian, so what you say about sharks.
Yeah, it resonates.
Resonates, right? Yeah, I so get it that if you disrupt the whole, it's just like a whole ecosystem. If you disrupt the main predator, then the rest of the ecosystem just falls apart.
And people can understand that if you talk about tigers or jaguars, but it's the same thing with sharks, but they don't want to see it that way because people think of the ocean as endless. They recognize the forest has a start and a finish. The ocean is endless. Why should we restrict things? But we are really destroying not just shark populations, but ocean biodiversity at an unbelievable rate.
Mm-hmm. I've spoken to other women who've been working in the conservation space or activists. One of the things that they've said is, for example, I spoke to somebody who said when she started in her career, she was working for Greenpeace in Australia. She was protecting forests, and now she finds that in fact she's needing to protect the world. And that's a whole different ball game. Do you have the same feeling of that the problems that are facing us are becoming overwhelming?
I think the problems have always been overwhelming. You just have to pick the niche and what problem am I going to be able to address? If I really think of all the problems I'm not addressing, right? It's impossible. I can't solve climate change single-handed. I can't stop tropical forests from being converted to oil palm. I'd like to. But you have to sort of say, this is what I can make a difference on. This is what I have expertise in. I'm going to grow my expertise and mentor others. So yeah, we're all trying to save the world, but you have to pick where do you think you can make the most difference? And I've always tried to look at it that way. Both how can I make a difference and how can I mentor others, younger people coming up, particularly women, to work in a policy forum. Yeah. Believe me, there were very few women when I started.
Were there? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And now?
It's changed a lot. When I first started with Fish and Wildlife Service, I sat in a room, there were 20 people, and I was the only woman, right? So, it took me, wait a minute. And that's not the case, not only in fish and wildlife, but we're seeing it in many other governments. Some governments know. Latin American governments, some tremendous change over the years in numbers of women trained scientists, PhDs working in the government and in NGO, non-governmental organizations. That has changed. Maybe not enough at the highest level, in the senior level, but that's not only in conservation. But it has changed over the years. Yeah.
I'd like to come back to that, but before I do, I'd like to ask you: is your looking globally at wildlife and wildlife conservation? You made the observation that the biodiversity of the oceans is being decimated, and on land, what direction are we going in?
We're going in the same direction. But I refuse to be a pessimist. Maybe you can't be a conservationist and be a pessimist, first of all. Yeah. I tend to look at, since I started, are there species who have increased, areas that have been protected that wouldn't have been otherwise, right? We are destroying habitat. We're destroying tropical forests at a depressing rate. But there's more recognition now of the importance of forests for biodiversity and for climate change. I think that people understand how much has been lost and destroyed terrestrially. I don't think they're there yet in the ocean. But yeah, terrestrially as well, if I go back and look at, when I moved recently, I looked back at old documents that said there were only 8,000 tigers remaining. And then there were only 5,000. Now there are only 2,000. It's like, well, what difference have we made? But there are places like China, the Russian Far East, and some other places where tiger populations have increased or have stabilized. So and in India as well. So we have to focus where we have had successes. And there have been a lot of successes. And there are governments starting to take action on sharks as well. Large number of species are now covered by CITES. That wasn't a given in the 90s. So
I always feel like in conservation, it's so hard for people. I think people globally realize that we've got major problems, but it's so hard for people to say, well, the tiny little bit that I do, what's the impact that I'm having? And what can I do in my little life? And just making the link between what each of us does and the overall picture.
I think as a consumer, at least we can understand that more. What you buy, what you eat has a direct impact. If nobody ate and bought palm oil, there would be no more conversion for oil palm. I'm not saying I can snap my fingers and make that happen, but people are not buying ivory. There are laws not to buy ivory, but if you talk to most people in Europe and the US, they would never even think of buying ivory. So I think we as consumers can make a difference. It's hard to think I'm just one person. How much does it matter if I buy, something with palm oil or not, or if I buy something produced sustainably or not? It makes an enormous difference because it all adds up. So I think people understanding their role, I think that's changing. I think in Europe, people are more aware of their role as a consumer than in the US, but I think it's changing in the US and Australia, for example, as well. I think that's one way for people to understand. Anything you buy, anything you eat, anything you wear, where did it come from?
Yeah, easy.
Easy to ask, not always easy to answer, but it's worth always asking that question. And you can make a difference that way.
Yeah. Sue, you were saying that when you first started in your career, you were one person of 20 around a table.
One woman of 20.
One woman, not one person. One woman of 20 around a table.
Yeah, there are plenty of guys. Yeah.
What's been your experience as a woman in your career? Has it been positive, negative, neutral?
I've had a very successful career, so I guess you could say it's been positive, but there have been challenges. There have been tremendous challenges along the way. There are a lot of alpha males running around in conservation who obviously have all the answers, right? There are also, work-life balance is always an issue that in the U.S. now people understand. Nobody understood that or talked about it 30 years ago. It was not only being a woman. At one time, I was a single parent. I had a young child, and there are challenges of juggling. It's simplistic to say you have to be 3 times as good to progress, but it's true. You have to work 3 times as hard to get to the same place. Hopefully that's improved with greater understanding and all of that. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard. But I feel I've had a successful career. So, I guess it wasn't an impossible situation to overcome, but I was always conscious and aware of it. For example, I'm very honored that I was elected to be on the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature Global Council, representing the U.S. Okay.
Fantastic.
And I went back into the files, and in the 75-year history of IUCN, I'm the first woman from the U.S.
Wow.
And I looked at that and I thought, I can't believe this. Nobody ever noticed that it was, all white men since 75 years ago. Things have to change, and we have to stop and say, wait a minute, what's wrong with this? So it's just an example.
It is changing. And again, I think there's awareness, but on the ground.
And I think we have to do the mentoring and create the opportunities for advancement for women, for minorities, et cetera. It's not only about women, but in a lot of countries, we have to create a career pathway for other minorities that might be intrigued by a career in conservation, but don't even know how to get started on it.
What work does the Wildlife Conservation Society do with people on the ground? So, people who are, living next to where the elephants are.
Most of our work is with local communities and indigenous people who live with wildlife, either in parks or protected areas or around the parks and protected areas. And a lot of our work is working with local communities, so they have livelihoods that are good and growing, and they don't have to overexploit resources of protected areas, but also so that they have their knowledge is respected for indigenous peoples, that their knowledge and their understanding of wildlife is part of the work, part of the understanding. So I'd almost say I don't know too many places where we don't work with local people and indigenous people, if that's relevant, or local communities. That's kind of part of our DNA even, that's how we work. We work with governments at the national and local level, but we are part of and work very closely with local communities. And most of the countries we work in, our staff are locals from those countries. We're not importing a lot of Europeans or Americans to other countries. We're trying very hard to mentor local people as well, educationally, provide opportunities for higher degrees, et cetera. It's all part of the way that's the way you have to do conservation.
Yeah.
We're not coming in from New York. This is what you have to do. Not at all. So, and the solutions that we may be promoting are going to be different in each country because the reality on the ground is different too.
I love that, and I love all that you've said and all that you're doing. And I think it's having a full career in conservation is just fantastic. And thank goodness there are people like you.
Thank you.
People like there. Thank goodness.
I've been lucky. My daughter might say I spent too much time traveling and working when she was younger, but that's a different issue.
Sue, is there anything, as we bring this to a close, is there anything that we've missed? Anything that you'd like to say? Is there a message that you'd like to give to people who are listening?
One interesting point, because people have always asked me, how did you get into this career? And I didn't do my undergraduate and then my PhD thinking of working on international policy and wildlife trade and other policy issues. So I think sometimes you have to go with your passion. I always tell people, go with your passion, study what you want. Even if your mother wants you to be a doctor, if you want to study amphibians and reptiles, which is what I did, go ahead. But when you're looking for a job or you're looking for a career, keep your mind open to what the universe may send you, because you never know what might really. Don't apply for things that you're not interested in, but keep your mind open because there may be pathways you hadn't necessarily thought about. And that's what happened to me. It worked out well. I started in something in Washington, and I love the policy nexus. And I think I mentored a lot of younger people, and I always say, go with your passion, but keep a very open mind to what might become available.
What I'm hearing is you went with your passion, but you also worked extremely hard.
Very hard. Yeah.
And you've seen the fruit of all that hard work.
Yes, sometimes you look back and say, what did I accomplish last year? Sometimes, well, particularly in the pandemic year. But I think if I look back, frightening to think I could look back 30 years. But yes, there have been a lot of changes in conservation, successes, but also in the attitudes of public and governments to some of these issues. Yeah.
Mm. Sue, thank you so much for your time. It's been just such a joy to meet you and learn what you're doing. And I hope that we have a chance to have further conversations on further successes in the conservation space.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.